In the last lecture, we talked about one of the great reversals in this book, namely the life of Haman, who had gone from being the number 2 man in the entire Persian Empire to being hanged on the gallows that he had constructed on which to hang Mordecai. Well, now as we begin chapter 8, we're going to see another great reversal take place, this one in the life of Mordecai. So chapter 8 verses 1 and 2 begin by saying, on that day, namely the day that they hanged Haman, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So we see this great reversal. Everything that had been Haman's, the signet ring and the power and position, are given to Mordecai, and the house of Haman is given to Esther. So Mordecai, in effect, becomes the prime minister of Persia. And so in other words, all of Haman's wealth, title, position, and power now belong to his enemy, Mordecai the Jew. Verses 3 through 7 go on then to say this. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite, and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. Then she said, if it pleases the king, and I have found favor, if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Now, remember that the laws of the Medes and Persians could not be revoked, and consequently the edict to annihilate all the Jews was still in effect. Now, even though Esther and Mordecai might have personally been safe, their fellow Jews throughout the empire were still in as much danger as they had been since the edict had been issued. And consequently, Esther's pleading on behalf of all of the Jews, and as she did when she made her request for her life and the life of her people at her second banquet. She again mentions the letters devised by Haman, but she doesn't refer to the king's involvement in that. And again, she's making her request very personal. She fell at the king's feet and wept and said, how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall to my people and the destruction of my kindred? Now, Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, adds that when she made this plea to the king, she also showed him the edict that had been written by Haman. And although that, again, is not in the biblical account, it's consistent with the king's not previously having been aware of the terms of the edict or the fact that the people slated for destruction were Jews. That leads us to chapter 8, verses 7 through 14, how the king authorizes a new edict to be issued. So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he had stretched out his hand against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors and the princes of the provinces which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on the steeds sired by the royal stud. In them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in each and every province was published to all of the peoples, so that the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, hastened and impelled by the king's command, went out, riding on their royal steeds, and the decree was given out at the citadel in Susa. Now, notice, as was true with Haman's edict to kill the Jews, the king here plays no part in preparing the new edict to counteract Haman's edict. Instead, he places responsibility to do so with Mordecai and Esther. But this new edict parallels Haman's edict. As was true with Haman's, it was sealed with a signet ring. It was directed to all 127 provinces in every language of the empire, and it specified the 13th day of the month of Adar, and it said, again, paralleling the language of Haman's, that now the Jews might destroy, kill, and annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. And so the Jews had now plenty of time to prepare for the great day. And so the decree was, as with Haman's edict, distributed to all the provinces and in Susa by royal couriers. Now, interestingly, the decree was issued on the 23rd day of Sivan, which is 70 days after Haman's decree. Now, Stephen Nall states that the 70 days would suggest to Jewish readers that predicted 70 years of exile. However, there's no reference to any return to Israel. And so this may be, again, a subtle hint or implication that God's new act of salvation and covenant happens to the Jews that are continuing to live among the nations. And so if that's the case, again, it's a veiled allusion to the church and to the new covenant, because, as I mentioned earlier, the Jews here were living among Gentiles throughout the Persian Empire. They were living in a society, the values of which are considerably different from their own. Likewise, the church is present throughout the world, a world in which the spiritual morals and values of virtually all cultures and societies are considerably different from those of the church. And in many respects, the church is the new true spiritual Israel, the fulfillment of which Old Testament physical Israel was a type and a shadow pointing to the church. And so again, this may be a subtle hint of that, looking forward to the church and to the new covenant. And by the way, for more on the church as the fulfillment of the types and shadows of Old Testament Israel, and the church as the new true spiritual Israel, we talk about that in great detail in our Ecclesia book on biblical theology. Well, this then leads to chapter 8, verses 15 through 17, which say, "Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. In each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. So, just as was true when Mordecai was being honored by the king and being led around on the royal steed in royal robes, so now Mordecai leaves the king's presence in the royal robes. And so, what a reversal of a man who just shortly beforehand had torn his clothes and was wearing sackcloth and ashes. And now the reference to the people rejoicing in Susa probably refers, of course, to the Jews in Susa, because the edict allowed the Jews to kill any non-Jews who were attacking them. Now, another great reversal takes place in verse 17, where it says that, remember earlier, the Jews were in great mourning, and they were fasting and weeping. Now there was great gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. On the other hand, now it's the non-Jews who are in dread of the Jews, and it says many of the people in the land became Jews. Now, Josephus reports that many other nations circumcised their foreskin in fear of the Jews, that they might thereby procure safety. Now, that suggests that although some of the conversions to Judaism may have been genuine, others were simply a means of self-protection. And again, that fact, again, is a veiled pointer to the church, which consists of people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, according to Revelation 5, verse 9. Because it's also true that the outward, visible church consists of people who have been truly converted to Christ, but it also includes people who may have gone through the outward signs of conversion, including baptism, but have never been truly converted. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew 7, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, look at all we did in your name.'" Jesus doesn't dispute that, but he says, "Depart from me. I never knew you." Because only the Holy Spirit can truly regenerate a person's heart. Now that leads us to chapter 9. In chapter 9, the first 10 verses say this: "Now, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's commandment and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps and governors, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews, because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all of the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Porantha, Adalia, Eridatha, Parmashta, Erisal, Eridai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamandatha, the Jews' enemy. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now, in these verses, we see how quickly circumstances can change. These point out that verses also point out that hatred of the Jews was not limited to Haman, because the Jews, it says, their enemies existed all across the empire. But because of the rise of Mordecai, the provincial leaders now assisted the Jews. And even though the king's edict gave the Jews the right to take the plunder of those they killed, they did not do that, which indicates that their motive was not personal enrichment. And it names at the end the 10 sons of Haman, who it indicates they were all killed. Now, which leads to verses 9 through 15. On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? And it shall be granted you. And what is your further request? It shall also be done." Then said Esther, "If it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. So, again, after reporting that 500 men had been killed by the Jews in Susa, the king granted Esther the right to petition him again. And she requested that the Jews have another day. Remember, the 2 edicts of Haman and of Mordecai and Esther had specified 13th of Adar as would be the day of battle. Well, now she is requesting that in Susa, the Jews also be allowed to kill their enemies on the 14th of Adar, and the king granted that request. And despite the fact that the 10 sons of Haman had already been killed, she requested that their dead bodies be hanged on the gallows, and the king granted that request. That hanging of the dead sons is a form of public degradation of Haman's household and a warning to the people of Susa, and also may have been seen as a deterrent against further persecution of the Jews. And the extra day enabled them to kill another 300 of their enemies. But again, they refused to take any plunder, which leads to verses 16 through 19. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and kill 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns made the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting, and sending portions of good food to one another. So, because of the extra day granted to the Jews in Susa to kill their enemies, the celebrations of the rural and the urban Jews fell on different days. 14 Adar in the rural areas and 15 Adar in Susa. And in all, 75,800 non-Jews were killed. But again, it says the Jews did not seize the plunder, which leads to the rest of chapter 9, verses 20 through 32. These verses talk about how Mordecai and Esther establish the new feast of Purim. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing, and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do, and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the adversary of the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. And because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen and in this regard what had happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely, words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for the times of fasting and their lamentations. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. Now, the celebration of Purim was formalized by Mordecai and Esther. And again, the name Purim comes from the casting of the lot, called the Pur, that Haman had used to determine the 13th day of Adar was to be the day when the Jews were attacked. Purim would be celebrated on both the 14th and 15th of Adar, thus combining the days on which the rural Jews and the Jews in Susa had celebrated. Now, Purim is a mandatory and a perpetual celebration. It's to be characterized by feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And in the apocryphal book of 2nd Maccabees, it is called the Day of Mordecai. Now, Purim is celebrated by Jews around the world to this day. It, along with Hanukkah, is referred to as a minor festival only because work is permitted on that day. Rabbi S.M. Lehrman says that Purim is not intended to commemorate revenge, vindictiveness, and the downfall of our enemies, but to keep evergreen in our minds the hope of the ultimate triumph of that which is just. Now, Purim is celebrated by fasting on the 13th month of the day of Adar in commemoration of Esther's 3-day fast. Then on the 14th and 15th, scripture verses are read, the book of Esther is read, gifts are given, and it's obligatory to eat, drink, and be merry on Purim. And so, because sending gifts of food and gifts to the poor is part of the mandatory celebration of Purim, Purim is a festival which integrate the essential teachings of Judaism along with faith, hope, and charity. And Rabbi Lehrman commented, "We observe Purim to recall lessons that we cannot afford to forget. Chief among them is that the Jew can never substitute trust in human power for unshakable faith in God." And that lesson applies to Christians as well. Now, the Jews, in connection with Purim, I mean, as it said in verse 22 of chapter 9, the Jews turned from sorrow to gladness and from mourning into a holiday. And the rabbis also say that Purim is eternal. That one Torah scholar said, although all memories of the difficulties endured by our people will be nullified, the celebration of the days of Purim will not be nullified. It is to be an eternal celebration. Now, what was true of the Jews? Again, this is a subtle pointer ahead to Christ and the church and the gospel. Because in the Beatitudes, Jesus said, "Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh." Now, This was anticipated in Old Testament references to the coming of the Messiah. Now, we are in the Messianic age now, but we still continue to experience problems and sorrow and death. And consequently, the laughter that Christ is referring to primarily will take place in heaven and then in the new heavens and the new earth forever. Because then there will be no more crying, pain, death, curse, or sin. Cornelis Venema says, absent the presence of sin and its consequences, God's people will know only unending joy and delight in God's presence in the new heaven and the new earth. So that is really kind of a fulfillment of the idea behind Purim, which leads to the last chapter, only 3 verses, chapter 10, which focus on the greatness of Mordecai. But chapter 10, verse 1 begins, now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. Now, remember, the book in chapter 1 began by talking about how the king displayed all of his riches and the splendor of his great majesty for 180 days. Well, the book ends by telling us one important way how the king obtained all that wealth, by laying a tribute on the land and the coastlands. And the word for tribute is used elsewhere in the Bible of forced taxation and involuntary labor. And so the king's wealth was not actually the riches of his royal glory or his great majesty, but was forcibly obtained from the wealth and labor of others. Now, taxation may be necessary for governments and countries to exist, but ultimately all taxation and all governments are backed by power and force. Some are more blatant about it, and some are more subtle, but the ultimate basis is the same. It's the government wields the sword, as Romans 13 says, which leads to the last 2 verses of this book, chapter 10, verses 2 and 3, which say this, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. And so again, as was true of the king, the greatness of Mordecai was not really his. Verse 2 says that it was the king who advanced him. And that's true for every one of us. We all have certain gifts and abilities and positions and responsibilities, but ultimately they're not ours. God is sovereign over everything. His plan is absolute and includes everything. He raises some up, he puts others down. He puts thoughts in our minds. For Christians, the Holy Spirit distributes spiritual gifts as he determines to each believer. Now, we've seen throughout Esther how seeming coincidences throughout the book are not really coincidences. God used even Haman and his sin to bring about the great reversal of the fortunes of Mordecai and the Jews. I mean, even the date of 13 Adar, determined by Haman's casting the pur, was not by accident, because Proverbs 16, it talks about people cast lots, but God determines the result. Now, it is true, many of us have worked hard and done well in school or in business or elsewhere, but ultimately God gave us the abilities we have. We did not cause ourselves to be born into our particular families, to our particular countries, into our particular socioeconomic situation, or in the time we're born. We didn't give ourselves our physical characteristics or personalities or the natural abilities we have. All of it comes from God. Now, our responsibility is to be faithful with what God has given us. Now, Mordecai demonstrates this in his own life. He used his authority and strength to bring about great accomplishments, according to verse 2. He found favor with his many kinsmen because he sought the good of his people, and he spoke for the welfare of the whole nation. In other words, not just the Jews. Even though he was a Jewish exile in a foreign land, he saved the life of a Persian king. His life epitomized what Paul said in Galatians 6, verse 10, where he says, "So then, while we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." And as a result of acting like that, Mordecai was great among the Jews and in favor with his many kinsmen, and his deeds are written down in the book of the Chronicles. Now, most of us will never have the position and authority of either Mordecai or Esther. Nevertheless, we are called to be faithful, doing good to all people, especially to those who are of the household of faith, knowing that our Father who sees what is done in secret will reward us. And our rewards will be openly displayed and will last forever. Our lives are more important than we may think. Even the smallest acts of kindness and faithfulness may have unanticipated and long-term consequences both in this life and in the life to come. Consequently, we should remain faithful in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, because by our faithfulness, God will be glorified through us, just as he was through Mordecai and Esther. So that concludes the book of Esther, a fascinating story with some lessons for us. So may we meditate upon this and live lives of faithfulness to the benefit of not only of the church, but of all people as well. God bless you.